Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main textbook for the class is scheduled to be ASP.NET with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor. Alright, as you can see, I have also decided that before doing this, maybe I should just put it this way, I've decided that before doing this, that what I'm going to do is to go over many of the chapters in this textbook, Professional ASP.NET MVC 5 by John Galloway of Microsoft and others. So far I've gone through the first 9 chapters. I'm skipping chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, and I'm going to pick it up again right here on Chapter 14, which is on unit testing. You may or may not remember, but when I come in here and I start up, so there's no project here, so if I come in here and I say new project, and you know the drill by now, I go into ASP.NET here. I'm going to do this a little bit different. I'm going to call this unit test. All right, and I'm going to click OK, but this time I'm going to choose MVC, which gives me that, but I'm going to choose Add Unit Tests. And what you'll see in just a moment when I tell it to go ahead and create this is I'm going to get let the system show you for me. We still get all of the stuff that we've been talking about, that you get with a regular MVC app. In other words, I still get my app data, app start, content, controllers, fonts, models, scripts, and views. But if you look down here, I also get something that's called unit test.tests. And that's where I can do my unit tests. So we've got 3 objectives in this chapter: understanding unit testing and test-driven development, building a unit test project, and advice for unit testing with your ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Web API applications. Again, I'm skipping the ASP.NET Web API. All right. So, as mentioned here, unit testing has become recognized as being essential in the software quality process. Most professional developers do some form of unit testing. Many do TDD, test-driven development, which sounds kind of ass backwards, pardon my French, but in that case, you write the tests before you write any code. As it says, it allows the developer to evolve the design in an organic way while still gaining the quality and regression testing benefits of unit tests. All right, ASP.NET MVC was written with unit testing in mind. The chapter focuses on how unit testing and TDD in particular apply to ASP.NET MVC. As mentioned, unit testing is a very large subject. You can get entire books on this. The second half of the chapter includes real-world advice for unit testing, and also, for both ASP.NET MVC and Web API. But again, I'm concentrating myself on the ASP.NET MVC side. All right. So the author says when we talk about software testing, we're referring to a whole host of different activities, including unit testing, acceptance testing, exploratory, performance testing, and scalability testing. All right, they're starting with unit testing. Now, before we even define it, why do you test? All right, you test to make sure whatever it is you've created not only works, but if it's something that you've created that's not brand new, if you're creating something that's going to be added, for example, to an existing project, you want to make sure you don't break what's already there. So they say most developers have some exposure to unit testing and some opinion on what works best. In our experience, the following attributes tend to be present in most long-term unit testing. Number one, testing small pieces of production code or units. So the idea is, first of all, while you're testing, if I'm writing 1,000 lines of code, I shouldn't write 1,000 lines of code then start to test. I should write as many lines as I need to get started. Then I should test that. Then I should add some more, and I should test that, etc. And while I'm adding new code and testing it, I should also test to make sure I didn't break any existing code, be it mine or someone else's. Testing in isolation from the rest of production code. Testing only public endpoints. Running the test gets an automated pass-fail result. Now, before we go into this and talk about each of these rules separately, a few things to keep in mind. One of the things here is what the author mentions is it is impossible to test everything, especially if you are adding to somebody else's existing code. Yes, you want to make sure that their code, that you haven't broken their code, but at the same time, it's not your responsibility to test their code. It is your responsibility to make sure you didn't break their code. All right, so the following sections examine each of these rules and how they impact, all right, and how they impact the way you write unit tests. Number one, testing small pieces of code first. As it says here, in an object-oriented language such as C#, this usually means nothing larger than a class. And in most cases, you're testing a single method within a class. And the reason, here's one of the key takeaways from the chapter. The reason to test small pieces of code is that it allows you to write simple tests. One of the things that we've talked about in, maybe not so much in this class, but I've talked about in earlier classes that I've taught, and that is that in an ideal world, each method should have a single purpose. If each method has a single purpose, then the unit test you write for each method, basically you should write one unit test. All right, because that's what a single method is. It's doing one thing. All right, again, that goes kind of counterproductive to the way many people actually write code. I've given this example before. If you look at it, and this is maybe kind of silly, maybe it's a little overkill, but let's suppose for a second that I'm having something where I ask you to enter your first name, your middle name, your last name, your street address, your city, your state, let's say your cell phone, your email address. All right, maybe at the beginning we were asking you to put in, I don't know. Let's say that you work for a company, so I also ask you for your social security number and your employee number. I'm going to leave it right there. I think that's about 10 pieces of information. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Good. So in an ideal world, this will involve 10 different input methods. An input method for each one of these input fields. That's the good news. The bad news is that's not how most people write code. Most people would write code, and not everybody, but most people would write code where they would have something that would be called like input info. And they would have all 10 of these. Well, technically what that means is that is 10 different tests you'd have to run on the same method, which is not considered the best way of doing things. Source code is read far more often than it is written. This is especially important in unit tests, where you attempt to codify the expected rules and behaviors of software. When a unit test fails, the developer should quickly be able to read it to understand why it failed. Much harder when you're doing more than one thing at a time. Testing and isolation. Another important aspect of a unit test is it should very accurately pinpoint where problems exist. As just mentioned, that's harder to do when you're putting multiple things in the same method. You need to isolate your code from the other complex code with which it might interact so that you can be fairly sure a test failure is due to bugs in the code you're testing. It is the job of the unit tests of the collaborating code to test whether it has bugs. In other words, if you're working and testing with other people, you can test your code and know whether or not it works. But technically, it's very hard for you to test somebody else's code. You can test how your code interacts with someone else's code. All right, but that's about it. Testing and isolation has an additional benefit because the code with which you will eventually interact might not yet exist. Yeah, if you're starting on a new project and there are a lot of you who are working together on the same project. All right. Testing only public endpoints. Many developers who start unit testing often feel the most pain when it comes to change internal implementation of a class. A few changes to code can cause multiple unit tests to fail. When writing unit tests, if you limit yourself to the public endpoints of the product, you can isolate unit tests for many of the internal implementation details. This means changing the implementation details will break your tests less far often. If you find yourself having a hard time testing a class without looking into its internals, it's often a sign you might be doing too much. Again, your job is to interact with existing code, not to test the existing code, other than to make sure your code doesn't break the existing code. Making your class testable might require that you turn a single large class into several smaller classes so they're easy to test. The practice of ensuring you have a small focused single behavior class is known as SRP, or single responsibility pattern. All right. Automated results. It's pretty clear that you'll have a large number of unit tests. I will tell you this as an aside. All right. Several years ago, now we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years ago, I was a professional programmer for AT&T Bell Laboratories in Naperville, Illinois. The first time I ever had to do my own development, all right, I was writing code that would affect what was called PC, peripheral control, and RTA, routing and terminal allocation. Things were done much differently at that time. All right, we didn't have cell phones, so my testing involved rotary phones. And with peripheral control, for instance, some of the tests I had to do was I had to make sure that when I put in my code and I picked up the phone in our lab, that I still got dial tone. Then I had to almost literally slam the receiver down several times, maybe 10 times in a row, pick it up and make sure I still got dial tone. All right, so why am I telling you this? When I wrote my first design document, it was in the neighborhood of maybe 400 or 500 lines because I had that many tests, each page, front and back. So if it was 500 lines, I had 250 tests. On the front, I had the test and what the test was supposed to be testing, and on the back, I had the results of the test. To help the automation process, developers normally resort to a unit testing framework, which allows the developer to write tests in their preferred programming language and development environment. All right, they can create a set of pass-fail rules that the framework can evaluate to determine whether or not the unit test was successful. All right. Unit testing is a quality activity here on the bottom of page 410. Many developers choose to write unit tests because it increases the quality of their software. I would say that's always true. So unit testing here acts primarily, it says, as a quality assurance mechanism. Unfortunately, weaknesses exist with the ordering of tests after production code. You have to make sure that you are working with everybody, and you're working with people whose code you touch, even people whose code you touch that has been around forever. All right? That's a pretty good place to stop. I'll pick it up in just a couple minutes under defining test-driven development. So I'll pick it up there in part 2 in just a bit.